What's up, everyone? Welcome into the Dear Miss Fantasy show with me, your host, Tera Roberts. This is the official mailbag show for Player Profiler. It is Wednesday, July 8th. I am back. Sorry I missed last week, guys. I did warn you if you did watch the episode, though. I was on, I don't know if I would consider it vacation. I'm not sure. I did rest, so I think I technically have to consider it vacation. I was visiting family, taking my kids to go visit family. So unfortunately, plane conflicts, I could not do last week's show, but we are back. I am back, and it is time to go. I feel like it's been forever since I have talked to you guys, but we have a very interesting show because, one, we're going to take tons of questions here, but from recent videos, I pulled some comments from recent videos here for our questions or kind of statements, rather, that we could talk around. And as I was pulling, I noticed the big theme was around running backs, right? Because obviously, when it comes to running backs, I feel like wide receivers are a little bit more straightforward, right? Whether or not you believe in them, the upside that they can have, the position in their offense, there's not a ton of ambiguity, right? We know, for the most part, who's a wide receiver one, who's a wide receiver two, who's a wide receiver three, and what their actual upside is. But with running backs, as always, we've got these weird little pockets of running backs on teams where things are very unclear in terms of who actually has the highest upside. And I thought then who's the best draft target as well. So I thought it would be fun to bring up some of those comments as well, especially because, again, I've had a couple of running back videos and offensive line videos. So we've been circling around those. And of course, I will take your questions live here. Was a little distracted before because I was looking at another Ayuk video as he continues to just make the strangest statements, vague statements regarding Jaden Daniels. It's peculiar, to say the least. I still and I get this a lot in terms of questions, right? Especially, I even had someone ask me live when we were doing the live draft with Scott Fishbowl in terms of targeting Stephon Diggs versus Brandon Ayuk, right? Targeting Stephon Diggs right now while he is unsigned is perfectly reasonable, right? Because of the fact that we saw him last year coming off, and yes, he's older, right? But we saw him last year, older, coming off the ACL injury, and he still had a solid season, right? It wasn't a typical Stephon Diggs season, because he's no longer that player, but it was fine. I have the utmost confidence that he would make it through the season once he actually signs with the team, right? And all those legal issues were cleared up. So at some point, he's going to sign somewhere. He's probably just waiting on the most ideal situation for him. But once he lands somewhere, being a wide receiver two in an offense is very, very reasonable, right? But when it comes to Brandon Ayuk, mind you, it's been so long since we have actually seen this man on the field. The mentality doesn't seem there to be there whatsoever. And again, the 49ers have zero incentive to actually let him go at any point. It is what it is. They don't have to. He does not have the leverage that he believes he has. He can sit on roster until the end of time, not until the end of time, but for as long as they technically want, right? So it's kind of funny, but I can't see. I mean, I know that he wants desperately to go to the Commanders, but I just have a hard time seeing, after all the displays he's made on social media, that they would actually really want to bring that toxicity onto their team in any way, shape, or form. Jump into the comments before we jump into these questions here. What's up to Michael Alban in the chat here with the now these are one of the guys we're going to talk about here with the Brooks and Bill please comment from Michael Alban. We're going to talk about Jonathon Brooks, and we can talk about Bill as well. I've actually had to defend him a little bit recently because everyone is on the Rachaad White train, which is fine. It's not a big deal. It's one of those backfields where the ADP is not high enough on anyone for it to make that drastic of an impact, if we're being honest. But when I look at that backfield, right, I do have some remote optimism that he does know that his weak point in terms of him being able to be a 3-down starter was the pass blocking, right? And it has been said that he is working on it. He knows it. This is not an anomaly, right? You can develop that over time if you are incentivized to do so, right? So if we get into training camp, see improvement on that end from him, then yeah, Do I think he will ever get to the level in terms of skills from a pass blocking and receiving perspective as Rachaad White? Probably not, right? But enough to the point where the Commanders might feel comfortable keeping him out there on passing downs a little bit more and allowing some checkdowns to him. Yeah, I can realistically see that happening. Rachaad won't disappear at any point because at the end of the day, his skill set above all really is the fact that he is an excellent blocker and excellent receiver, right? He will get beat on the ground by both JCM and Bill and probably Katron Allen as well. But it's just a matter of how that fits with their offense and how they want to split that workload. But even if he doesn't have that receiving upside, he still can be productive if that Washington offense bounces back, right? Especially if there's just, a check down or two, right? It's very possible for him to have low-end RB1 upside, especially with Jaden Daniels being healthy, allowing for some more open lanes for him to go through. So we're looking for big chunk yardage plays there for him. And hopefully getting those goal line touches that were sniped from him last season by Chris Rodriguez. So despite the fact that it does look like a lot of people are still leaning towards going with Rachaad White, I still think there's value and potential there for Bill as well. And Jonathon Brooks, yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little Jonathon Brooks, right? Let me pull up my little graphics here. Is this the right one? Yes, it is. All right, let's talk about the Panthers backfield. I wanted to pull this one out because I love this comment. Let me try and remove my banner. No, actually, I don't have to remove my banner. You guys can see everything here. Had a comment here from Bucko Beamer on a YouTube video saying that he has been getting, I assume he, but could be she. Bucko Beamer has been getting both Chuba and Brooks in late rounds because they were both there. We saying that they did the draft after the NFL draft. And then also little comment there on the side there that the Browns will surprise some people in this Todd Monken offense. Real quick, before we dive into the Panthers, I like the second part of that comment a lot there because I've talked about the Browns recently. And you guys know how I feel about Kevin Stefanski, right? But Todd Monken is an excellent offensive mind. We saw the clear turnaround in terms of general improvement. Not that there was ever anything wrong with Lamar, but effective utilization and really digging into that upside, unlocking a special kind of upside with Lamar Jackson. So I love Todd Monken in the context of what he did in Baltimore. I also think that we'll see a lot more wide receiver usage because I think that's ultimately what he wanted to do when he was in Baltimore, but didn't really have the personnel beyond Zay Flowers to be able to achieve that. So, I mean, going in and seeing right off the bat there, drafted both Casey Concepcion and Denzel Boston within the first 2 rounds, we know exactly what he wants to do, right? He wants to increase the pass catchers there. And in addition to that, they were able to reinforce and hopefully upgrade that offensive line. So the key there for me is the offensive line. It's going to be a completely new look from last season. Very little is the same, fortunately, there, because it was really a massive underperformer last season. So theoretically can't be any worse. Do I know if all of those changes will really upgrade it to a top 12 unit? Skeptical on that, but I just need to at least see it get to league average. And then I do think we could see some surprises from the Brown here, which is why I do like Judkins a lot. I had an interesting comment on a video. I don't think it was one of my videos. I think it was maybe a FantasyPros video where I was talking about Judkins and someone I said, realistically, 1,000 yards and double-digit touchdowns is very possible for him. And got some pushback on a comment saying, no, he's not going to get to 1,000 yards. Just like a quick note there on him, since we're talking about the Browns offense, his pace was literally 25. His 17-game pace last season was literally 25 yards below 1,000 yards last season. So very possible, especially if there's even any just a remote bump up from this offensive line. And I definitely think we will get improved quarterback play because at the very least, they seem very settled in terms of knowing for sure, Dylan Gabriel we're not going to get any of the Dylan Gabriel experience, right? Hopefully we get a bounce back from Deshaun. And if that doesn't work out, we can get Shedeur Sanders coached in a better system by a coach that actually does want to work with him and actually try to help develop him. I feel like that was missing last season in terms of one of my faults with Kevin Stefanski being, or my issues with Kevin Stefanski being, the fact that I just don't know that he knows how to develop a quarterback, right? Because we saw those issues with Baker Mayfield. Kevin Stefanski, in terms of adapting his offense to fit around the upside of the actual quarterback that he has, doesn't seem like he really enjoys that, right? Which is why I get a little bit skeptical in terms of what is going to happen with the pass game beyond Kyle Pitts in Atlanta under Kevin Stefanski, just because I think Tua does fit what he wants to do in general, but I don't know that Michael Penix does. And so I'm worried that we might bounce into this weird back and forth kind of quarterback situation. And I just don't trust it completely. I do know that there will be tons of targets, at least 100 to Kyle Pitts, just based off the history of Kevin Stefanski, and don't have any fear for Bijan Robinson. But I do slightly worry about how that will affect Drake London in general. But his upside is so ridiculously high, and he is the wide receiver one of that offense. So it's tough to kind of fade him in any capacity there. But back to the Carolina Panthers here. Wanted to pull this one out again because I like this comment here. And I talked about this in my offensive line video as well. Jonathon Brooks and Chuba Hubbard are both very viable targets in fantasy drafts because at the end of the day, we know it's one of them, right? And, when it comes to ambiguous backfields and stuff, often the issue, right, in terms of us being concerned about there being committees or two running backs and whatnot, it's the third running back that's a little issue. Like when we talk about Denver in a little bit with RJ Harvey, if it was just RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins, we know what happened last year, right? But when you insert Katron, Allen, Jonah Coleman, Emmett Johnson, they're all just like one big running back to me. So if I say the wrong name, just drop me a chat and say, hey, Tera, remember, it's Jonah Coleman. But Jonah Coleman, throwing a little wrench in that as well in terms of how he fits into that. Even early on, we're hearing rumors about him, showing well in training camp. We know, and let me not kind of tilt my cap too much here, because I did want to pull out and talk about Harvey specifically here. But it's kind of like a three-headed question mark there. It's far more straightforward with the Carolina Panthers. This backfield, Trevor Etienne can contribute on passing downs, but there's not really a need for it because both Chuba Hubbard and Jonathon Brooks have zero issue in that area, and they both have the clear priority, so we don't kind of have to worry about that one at all. So when we're looking at this between these two running backs, we know that Chuba Hubbard is the starter. In theory, right? It sounds, and from what it sounds like, I'm trying to pull up the rankings here real quick for Chuba Hubbard, who is currently RB 28 in FantasyPros ECR. But it sounds like they're perfectly fine with Chuba Hubbard as the starter right now. And their goal here is to work in Jonathon Brooks. And the easiest path to do that is via the receptions, right? Passing downs, because that is a specialty. And why we loved him when we did have him drafted initially, he was one of the primary, if not the primary, like off the top of my head. Was it a weak draft class and he was the RB1? I can't remember if that was the case or not, but round 2 draft capital for, regardless, I can't remember if there was a first round running back in that draft class, but round 2 draft capital, high end round 2 draft capital for him. The reason why we liked him so much and we're targeting him in rookie drafts for Dynasty was because, again, that's a 3-down back. We don't have to worry about, can he block? Is he going to be able to catch? We know that's a skill set that he has. So the easiest way for them to integrate him in terms of, not trying to overload him too much, considering the injury history, is for them to work him in on passing down. So it sounds like they're prepared to do that like immediately. And it makes a lot of sense because, again, we're talking about a running back that they drafted in the second round. They want to see what he has, perhaps, in a better draft class in terms of depth for running back next year. They look at potentially investing in a running back, but they need to know what they do have in Jonathon Brooks to determine whether or not they actually do that, right? So we're looking at this, and you might think, okay, we like Jonathon Brooks a lot. The potential for him to take over in that offense. Chuba Hubbard can lose his job. He lost it last year to Rico Dowdle. Is it really worth it to target both of these guys? I do think so, right? Because when we're looking at this offense, when we're looking at Chuba Hubbard, yeah, Jonathon Brooks is a risk, but Jonathon Brooks is a risk to himself in terms of injuries, right? So if he is to get hurt in the second week of the season, the offense goes right back to Chuba Hubbard in the situation that he was in prior to Rico Dowdle being on the team, when he was consistently putting up very solid mid-tier RB2 numbers with low-end RB1 upside. So that alone at an RB3 price here in the draft is worth taking that risk. And then again, you can also turn around if you don't get him, or if you just prefer to draft Jonathon Brooks, you take that risk as well, because again, we've got Jonathon Brooks checking in here at RB42. That's not significant draft capital for us to be highly concerned about the fact that he could get injured and not play a full season there, right? So either one of these guys is actually excellent targets in terms of targeting an RB3 or later. RB3 for Chuba Hubbard and, less than that for Jonathon Brooks, because you're not drafting them to have to physically be a starter in your offense. High-end bench player, flex option for Chuba Hubbard right off the bat. And one of these guys here can end up being a low-end RB1 in terms of the upside. And I think it can push into that consistent low-end RB1 territory because of the offensive line investments that the Carolina Panthers have made. I mean, you can see the strategy that they've been doing in terms of kind of building the core in the trenches, both offensively and defensively here. And they've made both free agency additions. They've invested in first-round picks. They continue to build. And realistically, right off the bat, I do mentally rank this as a top 15 offensive line for sure. Borderline top 10, kind of right outside that range for me. And as they get into the season, it could develop beyond that as well. So this could be one of the better offensive lines in the league. We know that the Panthers want to be extremely balanced. They don't want Bryce Young chucking the ball upwards of 30 to 40 times a game, right? They want to keep it very balanced and lean on the ground game. So we should see a leap in volume with the improved offensive line. So again, I really like this one as just kind of sneaky targets. You need to keep your eyes on this backfield because something will come of this. And whichever one ends up whiffing, not a big deal, not a massive issue, right? Because the draft capital isn't a big investment there. Jumping here to the comments. Oh, thank you. Oh, let's see here. I pulled up the wrong one. I was going to say thank you to Donald Gillespie for saying smash the like. And then Casey Coleman says AJ Dillon is a dark horse in the Panthers backfield. Also, I'm a Packers fan. So I have followed him post Packers career. I think he's cooked, unfortunately. I think the step was lost a couple of years ago. So I don't see him as having that Rico Dowdle potential, to be honest, in this backfield, just because Rico is, has younger, more proven in terms of the ability to be a 3-down back. AJ Dillon hasn't shown that in a while, honestly. I mean, we even saw that once last year with the Eagles. I mean, they turned to Tank Bigsby when they needed to get some relief for Saquon Barkley, and Tank showed the massive upside, and AJ just wasn't it. So unfortunately, just from what I've seen, I think he's just reached that point in his career where he just can't put up those numbers anymore, sadly there. From Loving Life. I was wondering, since wide receivers who play on special teams get credit for kick return touchdowns, would Travis Hunter get points for a pick six? Okay, so I have him in, I have him still as a dynasty league. I have him in a dynasty league. Yes. It depends on the settings though. Double check on the settings in your league if that's possible, because I do think you have to have the defensive statistic. Well, yeah, I think it depends on the league settings. I do. Now that I think about it, I'm not 100% certain on that. I think theoretically he should, but some leagues might have it fixed in a way that it doesn't actually count for that. But technically speaking, I mean, yeah, theoretically, I think it might. So yes, but so again, well, Travis Hunter, real quick here, the ADP on him has dropped significantly. It might move up a little bit if we get more words on him in terms of saying he's going to play a little bit more offensive snaps. But realistically, I do think it's going to pan out as primarily defense with some more gimmicky plays on offense, just because if you look at the receiving core, they have too many bodies in terms of Jacoby Myers, Brian Thomas Jr., and Parker Washington. So in my opinion, I do think we're going to end up with more of him on defense, but it would be interesting to, in deeper leagues, do a dart throw on him in late rounds if the ADP remains pretty low, because you never know. At some point, if one of those wide receivers were to get hurt, you would have to potentially see him slot in at receiver and maybe be adjusted there. So that could be a little sneaky one. But yeah, I at first I was going to say, yeah, for sure, he would get that credit for a pick six, but I do think it depends on league settings. I think it varies there. From Supreme Link, we have a DP slot, DP player slot in one of my redraft leagues. Someone put Hunter in that spot as a cheat code. I have him in I drafted him in my Dynasty IDP league, and for as mediocre as his season was, it didn't hurt that much in terms of he was actually still someone that I could start on a weekly basis just because he was getting enough on offense and a little bit on defense there. So yeah, if you got a defensive player slot there, it is a strong pick there for a little cheat code for sure. Let me jump back here to some of the comments here because I had a lot earlier that I didn't see here. From Tootsie Pop. That is Rachel. How's SFB going for you? Also, to pick your brain, who is a player you believe will regress this year? SFB went wonderful. I did the live draft in Houston, which was weird because I enjoy the thing about the live draft is that the previous 2 years, our live draft was later than the start of the online drafts. So I very much enjoy using the tools that show, where everyone is being picked. So I'm not having that this year because we drafted maybe on the first weekend that it started was a little weird just to be like going with zero basis on what everyone else was doing, especially with all of the change settings. So that was strange, but I love my Scott Fish Bowl team. I got sniped a lot. I think our league is going to be very sharp. I got sniped a lot in some of the later rounds for sure there. But overall, I feel pretty good about it. It was a weird one for me because I enjoy, even in tight end premium, waiting on tight ends there, but I did not. I took my first two picks as Trey McBride and Colston Loveland. So that was it's very much so out of character for me. So it'll feel weird, but I'm looking forward to it, shaking things up a little bit this season. One player who I believe will regress this year, the easiest one for me to say, honestly, on that one is Christian McCaffrey. And I feel like people get up in arms when you say it, right? Because at the end of the day, they say, well, workload is workload. If it's Christian McCaffrey, if he stays on the field, it's 100% going to pay off. I get very concerned. One, regression is not always just decrease in touches or decreases in touchdowns and yardage. It's also regression on the body as well. So I get concerned that one, the massive regression will come in the form of injury for him, right? Because again, every time we've seen him have those overall RB1 seasons, he hasn't made it a quarter through the season. So that's the one that I'm like dancing around. Like someone made a comment on I did a video on the Scott Fish Bowl draft that we did, and someone made a comment like, oh my God, Christian McCaffrey dropped. Yeah, I mean, maybe people have the same mindset of me that the risk is just so incredibly high that you worry about is the upside. We know what Christian McCaffrey is, right, when he's on the field. But at the same time, you got to remember that you do see a little bit of regression, right? When even if he were to play an entire season, let's say that he were to play through injury, maybe, a little bit tired in terms of because it wasn't just like the carries. He went over the 300 carry mark for the first time in his career. He had over 400 touches. It was really egregious. To think that he's not going to come in the next season, and he is Christian McCaffrey, right? But to think he's not going to come in the next season and the legs aren't going to be a little heavy. I mean, that's what we saw with Saquon Barkley last season, right? I mean, the workload on him from the Super Bowl season was just so aggressive that he didn't quite look like himself last season. So CMC is the one that I have been dancing around, unfortunately. Like I think about it in drafts when he comes up, and I'm just like, ugh, I don't know if I can do it, right? So that's the one that is the big concern for me. Let me see if there's any off the top of my head that I do have some worry for in terms of regression. No, I think that's the main one. That's the big issue for me, for sure. Rachel also says, I just can't quit Chuba Hubbard. And we shouldn't. We should never. Michael Alvin says JK also is a good late one there. Yeah, we'll talk about JK in a second here with RJ Harvey. Casey Coleman says, we paid Chuba Hubbard so much, but we need to see what Brooks does since he was a second-round pick for sure. Let's see here. Big Bando TV says, surprised y'all didn't cover Javonte in the RB video. Where does he rank first? Where does he rank first for you this season? That's a good point. I have not talked about Javonte at all this offseason, which is very weird. I was very pro Javonte last season, which actually paid off a ton, right? Because that was another one where his ADP was like, it was in the 30s in terms of positional rankings. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was, mid 30s, I think. And I made a lot of investments into him, and that paid off. Jesus Christ, that was a good one. Because it wasn't a massive upside season, but for the value that you got where you were taking him, absolutely insane. I have Javonte. What are my rankings? Psych, they're not up. My rankings. Wait, pull them up. Glad the internet is doing well here. I have Javonte as RB 15. That is right after Kenneth Walker, Josh Jacobs, Jeremiah Love, Javonte Williams. And then after him is Travis Etienne, Kyron Williams, Breece Hall, Judkins, Scattaboo, and so on. I feel good about that one, right? It's not one that I'm like, oh man, I gotta get Javonte, but it's a very safe pick. I talked about him in my Scott Fishbowl video. And I think I might have spoken like a little, not negative, but like the pick bothered me because I was trying to get Josh Jacobs because I was shooting for a specific build in terms of high upside guys. And I do think that Jacobs is significantly undervalued because of the whole legal situation. Like prior to that, was a borderline top 10 guy in terms of rankings though. So it's moved up a little bit, but he dropped back significantly in drafts. So I've been trying to get him a lot, but I wasn't able to get him in the Scott Fishbowl draft. He was taken right before me. And so I got Javonte. I just think it's a very safe pick, right? I wish with him, the only thing that I wish is that we had a little bit more receiving upside, but my hope here is that we talked about regression, right? In terms of negative regression, I feel like we could see a little positive regression with Javonte Williams because, again, it wasn't a massive workload season. So I'm not worried about him, because there were those, the down seasons, the injuries, the limited usage, right? So last year was a big leap in terms of actual usage for him. But my hope here is that we get some positive touchdown regression for Javonte Williams because we had so much tilting through the air there. So if we're looking at him in terms of the production that he had last season, oh no, I don't have the full stats up here. Let's see. He had 13 total touchdowns. Yeah, no, is that it? 13 total touchdowns last season, I believe. Yeah. No, is it 11 or 13? I can't tell. No. Yeah. It's 13. 13 total touchdowns last season for him. 11 on the ground, 2 through the air. Again, great season. Hoping that we might get him more into that 15 touchdown range, especially in terms of on the ground here, if we can have a little bit more in terms of goal line touches there for him. But overall, I don't feel like you can go wrong with him. RB 15, love the value for him. Pretty much a guarantee as long as he makes it through the season to pay off at his ADP with potentially higher upside. But again, the receptions just aren't there for him to ever get that, that good top 5 upside, right? So that's why he falls behind those guys like, the Chase Browns and whatnot. But at the end of the day, still a very solid pick there for sure. Let's see here. Minsk says, I like how you mentioned the offensive line of Carolina in the Fantasy Pros video. Thank you. I'm looking for good running backs on teams with good offensive lines. You got the number one and the clear backup. Yeah. It's so critical, right? Which is also why, side note, again, like going back to the offensive lines, why I think a guy like Cam Scatterbo is being a little bit undervalued as well. Now, his ranking has been creeping up a little bit, but honestly, like if I look at the rankings in general, I don't think that anyone will ever put him higher than a Javonte Williams. So I think there's a cap to how high that Cam Scatterbo can go. We're probably looking at like maybe an RB 17 max ranking for him in terms of ADP as we get closer to the season and we see, okay, he's clearly healthy, clearly good, going to be ready week 1 here. But that's another one that kind of I feel like is a little bit sneaky in terms of his ADP isn't as far back as the Carolina backs, but he does have a significant offensive line movement forward there. So that's another one. Yeah. Offensive lines. You cannot go, you know what? Actually, let's pivot here to a topic that I wanted to bring up. There we go. Got this comment on a video here, and we're talking offensive lines and targeting good offensive lines for running backs that you want to get, because at the end of the day, guys like, guys, our top 10 guys, offensive lines are critical, but they've got that massive upside that you can't, that offensive line is not going to make us pivot away from Chase Brown, right? He's been able to do it in terms of the receiving upside, and right, so at the end of the day, there are certain guys that we're okay if their offensive line is a little subpar, mediocre. But once you get to that like low end RB2, high end RB3, and the general RB3 area, that is where the offensive line starts to play a big role. And I feel like that comes into play specifically for the Texans there, not just with CJ Stroud. Oh, I meant to update this picture to also include David Montgomery. Sorry for the visuals, because I mainly wanted to talk about David Montgomery here. Mailbag question that I pulled out of my comments here was, what are your thoughts on the Texans offensive line? Ironically, in my offensive line video, I did talk about the Texans. I cut it out because the video got too long, and I noticed I've been yapping a little bit more on my shorter videos there, and it's not a good thing. So I was kind of trying to condense it down, but I should have kept the Texans in there, because that is one of the more critical ones for us, because it's obviously critical for CJ Stroud, but I think it's actually more critical for David Montgomery, because again, as we're sitting here and we're talking on this theme of how we're targeting running backs and the offensive lines, one of the things that is the most glaring change for David Montgomery in terms of his location switch is the change in offensive line there, because Detroit had its struggles last season. It was not perfect, right? It definitely regressed from their prior season. But at the end of the day, it was still miles ahead of what the Texans offensive line was offering, right? So we've seen David Montgomery in this great offensive system, a system that, is very generous in terms of leaning on the running backs, provides ample goal line opportunities. The offensive line knows what it's doing in general. Even when they have their wayward situations, it's still better than a lot, right? And so we're looking at him going to the Texans. I've got some fears because as we talk about the Texans offensive line every single year. Have they made the changes to improve it? And the one thing that I did notice as I'm going back through and looking at the Texans and their draft picks and offensive lines, because they were finally able to make a first round investment into an offensive lineman, perhaps their offensive line struggles have been the fact that they have been trying to retool with veterans, right? Because of the trades that they made with them getting CJ Stroud and Willie Anderson, they were without a first round pick for a couple of years, right? And so as they were trying to retool that offensive line, they couldn't invest in a young, promising offensive lineman. They would turn around in the second round and they would get an offensive lineman in the second round, and then they would retool with veterans, but their veteran choices just never worked out. So perhaps this year could finally be the year, because they were able to make that first round investment, that they can build around youth and actually build up this offensive line. But I'm still very skeptical, because a lot of it, in addition to the draft pick, was a lot of defense, free agency retooling yet again. So my fear here is that perhaps it's a coaching issue. And some, obviously personnel, yeah. But at the same time, you kind of have to wonder, why is it that you've tried to fix this offensive line for multiple years now and you haven't quite been able to do it? Because we just saw Chicago do it with them making trades, bringing in veteran offensive linemen, right? And they made draft picks as well. But at the end of the day, the core was built from the addition of free agents there. So I just get kind of skeptical here as to why Houston has struggled, and wondering if it's just maybe an organizational and coaching thing, because that can come into play, right? In terms of your positional coaches maybe not being able to get the best out of their players here. So I'm still skeptical of the Texans offensive line overall. Maybe we see some progress this year and it's not as bad, but I don't know that we're going to make that leap to where we need that offensive line to be for David Montgomery to succeed, right? And for CJ Stroud's volume to get to the point where he is regularly providing successful wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 assets there. I mean, the only person that I'm really interested in this offense is Nico Collins, because he is the unquestioned wide receiver 1. Like, I do feel positive about the emergence of Jaden Higgins on the outside and Jalen Noel, and perhaps we might be getting Tank Dell back. But I do think that while we should be, or the Texans sound like they're going to have Tank Dell in the mix and getting him ready, I would assume they will be very cautious and not try to put aggressive workload on him because this has been a pretty significant recovery here. So at the end of the day, I do still think it's just Nico that is going to be the dominating factor there in terms of wide receiver 1. So I give him a pass, despite the offensive line and quarterback being an issue there, just because he's got the pure volume thing and he's been doing it and dealing with it for multiple years now. But when it comes to the running backs, if I'm looking at the guys being drafted before him, like, let's see here. I'll pull up ECR so you guys can see, because I'm kind of on par with ECR in terms of the running back rankings for David Montgomery. But right before him are guys like DeAndre Swift, Quinshon Judkins, even Travion Henderson, right? And then right after him are Bashal Tootin, Jadarian Price, Jalen Moore and Chuba Hubbard, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, right? I can select multiple running backs before then that I like. I want a Cam Scatterbo. I'll take a DeAndre Swift. It's not a problem. I want a Quinshon Judkins. I'm on the fence about Travion Henderson, right? Then I will skip past David Montgomery, and I would go with a Bashal Tootin. I would go with a Jadarian Price. I just don't feel super comfortable with the upside ultimately being there for David Montgomery. It can be a safe pick in terms of like, hey, he's going to be a 3-down back. It's going to be pure volume, but I don't know that I would expect it to be the same situation of when they traded for Joe Mixon, who was coming off of back-to-back RB1 seasons, right? Joe Mixon was in prime form when he went to the Texans. So the transition of him into that Texans offense and him succeeding, I don't see the exact application of David Montgomery, who it's literally been like 5 years since we have seen him put up RB1 numbers there. And technically only one time in his career, right? So it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And who's to say that we don't get Woody Marks contributing on third downs as well? So if we're talking about a team that is a downgrade in offensive lineman situation, a downgrade in overall points production, they don't have to push aggressive volume because their defense is quite literally the best, right? So the goal line opportunities are not going to be as aggressive as they were in prior years with Detroit, right? So, yeah, I'm just kind of seeing mediocre volume for David Montgomery, not a pick that's going to kill you, but not a pick that's going to win your league, right? A safe-ish pick, but not as safe as you would possibly think because, again, it's been a while since we have seen him operate as a true 3-down back here. Jumping back to the chat here, pulling some comments that we had earlier. The Joey Wright was in the chat. Joey says, the good thing with Brooks is that I do feel like he's rising at this point. I was afraid it would get out of control, or is that I do feel like he's done rising at this point. I was afraid it would get out of control, but it settled nicely. I was worried about that too, to be honest. Because sadly that did happen with my boy, Kenneth Gainwell. Seems like he dropped one-ish spot recently, but because that's what happened with Kenneth Gainwell, right? You get worried that these hype trains, like I was prepared way back in March to target all the Kenneth Gainwell in the world. Was so pumped, super excited. And as you start to see it rise, you're just kind of getting like, oh, I mean, I'm still drafting him, but at the same time, I'm being a little bit more cautious that the build makes sense for my team because the ranking got a little bit egregious there, right? Not too bad, right? But the rise up, you were hoping you would get him in that RB40 range, but him, rising up and then probably maybe continuing to rise up a little bit more as we get to training camp and probably see those, it's a 1A, 1B, and, people start to get very excited. I too feel like we have seen a stoppage in the rise of Jonathon Brooks because I think the injury history will keep people from being too overly optimistic there, right? So that's the good thing there. Good comment here from Shivas DK says, doing my SFB, great video earlier, helped me get off to a great start. Wonderful. Good luck. And people, if you're doing your SFB drafts and you want to drop some comments on how it started or how it's going, I would love to hear those as well. Let's see here. From Slim Reaper, Dynasty 16-team league. QBs are Josh Allen, Caleb. RBs are Chase Brown, Jonathon Brooks, Chris Rodriguez, Mike Washington, James Conner. Wide receivers, London, Abuka, Waddle, plus depth. Tight end, Tyler Warren. Do I trade my 2027 or 2028 first for an RB2 or hold? And he says that is PPR, by the way. I love your wide receivers there. I'd be curious how you said 16 team super flex. I wonder how many wide receivers do you start and how many flex options do you have? I think I might hold right there. I think you might be okay, especially with it being a 16-team league, depending on who the RB2 is. I mean, if you want to drop the names of guys you'd be interested in, or you think if you've had any chats with your league mates to kind of get an idea of who you would target, maybe we can talk that through. But I think you might want to hold for now, right? Because you can, between Jonathon Brooks, if he does in fact make it to week 1 healthy, we know there's going to be at least some receiving upside for him. Chris Rodriguez, for right now, we still have the potential of him maybe getting some goal line touches there. I have a dynasty league where my build is very much like this, to where I've got Jonathon Brooks, Jonathan Taylor is my RB1, and then my RB2 is just kind of panning things out between like Corum and Manungai, and maybe one other running. Maybe is it Gainwell? Someone maybe a Gainwell. I think it might be Gainwell. So I'm holding right there and not trading for an additional back because I want to see how far I can get through the season to hopefully have one of these guys pan out in terms of an injury, pushing them up into a starting position. So you've got 2 guys, plus I do think Mike Washington is the direct handcuff there as well. So I'm okay with you holding for right now, but I'd be curious who you would want to target there for trading. Let's see here. Miles Logan says, made it to the live this time. Shout out to you. Glad you're here. And then he also says, which Jacksonville receiver would be the best to pick up? Parker, Myers, or BTJ? So it's funny because like Joey was just saying with the Jonathon Brooks ranking probably holding where it is, and we're getting, okay, that's still at a comfortable range here. The Parker Washington rank did not hold. Jesus Christ, that sucker rose up during the offseason. Because I've been a heavy Parker Washington truther, but I'm not going to lie. The raising of the ADP has been highly concerning for me. Because at the end of the day, it does specifically hinge on Travis Hunter playing defense 100%. Because if you just look at the setup of the offense, we know BTJ is playing on the outside, right? Parker or Jacoby Myers is flexible in terms of where he can play. We've seen it all over the place, but for where he was with Jacksonville last season with this exact group, he was very much so on the outside the vast majority of the time. That slot position is what is really the kind of kicker there. So in terms of who I want to target, their ADPs have, let me look at their rankings right now, actually. They've bunched up in a really, really weird way, right? So Brian Thomas Jr. is wide receiver 35. Parker Washington is wide receiver 38. And Jacoby Myers has now been pushed down to wide receiver 42, which is ironic because, again, his role on the outside, I do think, is very solidified. So the hype train around Parker Washington got very severe, but it got severe with reason because, again, if Travis Hunter plays on defense, I do see a scenario where the highest targeted player is, in fact, Parker Washington. So that's my prep. I want to target Parker Washington, especially when you think about Liam Cohen's offense conceptually. The reason why Parker Washington was succeeding at the end of last season, once he actually became a starter. So again, like, we have to contextualize it, right? In terms of, that was a third-year breakout that we saw. He was a year 3 player. It was a third-year breakout. It's just the fact that he did not start off as a starter. Once he actually got onto the field, which again did require injury to do so, he did have that breakout. But the reason that it happened, right, and because why he was so aggressively targeted, is because it made logical sense in terms of matchups. Liam Cohen, like, when we look at Liam Cohen in terms of what he does, it's very different from Seattle in terms of, that it doesn't matter the matchup. They are sending targets the way of Jackson Smith and Jigba. With Liam Cohen, it doesn't really work like that. He's playing matchups, right? So there is not an automatic 10 targets that are going 10 to whatever targets that are going to one player, right? The touchdowns are not going to one player. He will adjust it according to what the matchups are. So you get a game against Denver, Jacoby Myers and Brian Thomas Jr. are shut down. Lo and behold, you've got 10 targets to Parker Washington, right? So he is my preference there. And ironically, maybe now that Jacoby Myers' ADP is dropping, maybe that's actually the value pick that we want to target. But it's still Parker Washington for me. That's my preference there. It's just that you have to acknowledge that it is the riskiest pick between the 3 that you can make, because if they do push Travis Hunter back into the offense a little bit more, it directly affects Parker Washington. So just be aware when you're drafting him, before we have any specifics. And quite frankly, I don't think we're going to have specifics in training camp, because if you think back to last season with Jacksonville, they were the ones that pulled the wool over on us with all of the first team reps going to Tank Bigsby and Bashal Tutin, and had everyone thinking that Travis Etienne was not going to be anything for them to just ship off Tank Bigsby. And it really was literally just Travis Etienne, right? So there's only so much that you can look at Jacksonville in training camp and take stock, right? Try and listen to the beat reporters, honestly, and try and get a feel of how things, but even then, so the beat reporters were leaning pretty, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like they were leaning heavily towards Tank Bigsby and Bashal Tutin as well. So I feel like Jacksonville is a mystery. Just keep that in mind as you're targeting these guys, that Washington is the riskiest one. BTJ and Myers are likely the safest options for you to go with. So just keep that in mind. I don't think you can go wrong with picking any of them. My preference is Parker Washington, but honestly, they're all checking in at wide receiver, low end wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4. I mean, it's worth it to have a piece, right? Jumping back to the chat here. Ooh, Casey says, I hate to say it. I like a spicy comment. Casey says, I hate to say it, but I think JSN regresses a little Super Bowl hangover there. It's possible because it was a ridiculously high workload. No, at the end of the day, it was just interesting because I see a lot of people in drafts like looking at, in terms of late round picks, like looking at a Rashid Shaheed, right? Who, does give you the special teams upside. So depending on what kind of draft you're doing, that's always one to keep in mind, right? But at the end of the day, the target is just so ridiculous. But I do still think he's a clear third behind Puka and Jamar Chase as well. So yeah, regression. I'm not going to disagree with you on that one. Very possible because it was very, very egregious usage. But I can't take it away from him just because, again, like we've talked about the wide receivers a lot in terms of the fact that the only really safe options that you have early on are Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, JSN, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and it's a hard cutoff off that. I'm actually going to make a video. I I did a draft for Sirius XM with Fantasy Alarm. We do a July 4th draft. We actually did on July 3rd, which meant that I got to have a great time on July 4th. I'd have to draft, which it's fine. I like to stay somewhat clear-minded when I draft, so that was a good little advantage doing it on July 3rd instead this year. But we did that draft. I'm actually going to make a video on that draft. I'll probably post it Friday to my YouTube channel, doing a recap of that one. And I was thinking about that because I took Amon-Ra St. Brown in the first round, and those first 4 wide receivers are the hardest cutoff ever for me, because after that you get into CeeDee Lamb, who obviously has to deal with George Pickens. Then you have, what is after that? Justin Jefferson, the weird quarterback situation. Do we trust Kyler Murray? Drake London, weird quarterback situation. Who's it going to be? Tua, Michael Penix. Do we trust either one of them? I trust Michael Penix more, but honestly, the injury recovery and everything, I get very sketched out by the situation in terms of what to expect with these quarterbacks, and think we're going to see both of them, unfortunately, this season. Then you get into Nico Collins, who we talked about, the Texans offensive line situation. So JSN is a really good regression candidate. So I like this comment, but he still gets that default ranking just because he's one of the few guys without a sketchy situation. The fact that we've got into the point now that Sam Darnold as a quarterback is the non-sketchy option for you to have in terms of guys being drafted in the first round. That's funny. Going back here to comments here, going to catch up, which is fine. I'm a little bit behind here. I went back through the comments because I realized that I was missing a ton of them. So I'm going back here. Panda of Love says, Trav is the only Jag to have, I think. That's not a bad take. I do, Trev, not Trav. Trav is gone. Trev is the only Jag to take. I don't disagree with that in terms of concept, right? The only pushback I have on that is that, again, we're getting the wide receivers there at literally wide receiver 35 or later. So it's not like they'll hurt your team in any way, shape, or form, but, ball spread around and whatnot. But yeah, the key target for me here, and I do like Bashal Tutin, just because it's possible that he does become a 3-down back here. But Trevor, Jesus Christ, every time I read that, I see Trav. Trevor is the real target here for sure. What we saw at the end of the season from him, and I know that we have been fooled in terms of strong back half of the seasons from Trevor Lawrence to ultimately come around and disappoint us the next season here. But that was not with Liam Cohen. I have the utmost confidence of all coach. I have the utmost confidence in Liam Cohen and his ability to operate a functional offense, right, with extremely high upside. And the thing that makes me happy about the production that we saw from Trevor Lawrence at the end of last season is that the upside that we have, because really in the back half of the season, I can't remember what breakdown in terms of week it was, but it might have been the 50-50 split there. But in the back half of the season, the overall QB1 was Trevor Lawrence, right? So, and I'll go back and find out what exactly it was. Actually, you know what? I have stats here. Let me see if I can pull it up. I believe, let's put in weeks 10 through 18 and see. Yep, that was it. Weeks 10 through 18, Trevor Lawrence was the overall QB1, averaging 23.4 fantasy points per game. That is more than, Jesus Christ, that was 3 points more than Josh Allen. He was on a roll. And what it was really is that, again, things were gelling so well with the receiving core, which is also why I feel like tip-off wise, we got to be seeing Travis Hunter on defense with a little bit of gimmicky action on offense every now and then, because the offense gelled so well when the receiving core was Jacoby Myers, Brian Thomas Jr., and Parker Washington. It just worked, right? And more so than anything, in terms of Trevor having that solid core that he was able to kind of function and target any one of them and be flexible there. But really the uptick in terms of his rushing production there, that was key, which is interesting, right? Because as we try and figure out this backfield and Bashal Tutin or Chris Rodriguez, the Quentin Allen Jr., how much does he contribute on passing downs? Who can be a 3-down back? Is it just going to be a nasty committee? At the end of the day, all of that probably benefits Trevor Lawrence in terms of having that potential goal line preference and the touchdowns there, because that's what really got him gelling from a fantasy perspective. I mean, let me pull up the game logs here. He was, let me see, week 9, he had 2 rushing touchdowns, week 11, 1, and then week 15 through 18, he had 1, 2, 3, 4. One of those games was against Denver. So just reference there, because some of those were a little bit easier games there. It was definitely a front-loaded schedule, but he did very well in terms of, did I call out the right weeks? Yeah, I did. He did very well there in terms of being able to take advantage of several bad defenses, and then had one excellent game against Denver as well. So I think there's a lot of potential for him for sure. Question here for Michael Alban. Says the Ravens drafted first OG in the draft, I think, and then strong offensive line other than center, Lamar MVP. I feel this one is a controversial one, right? Because losing Tyler Linderbaum, and they did replace him, right? So that's fine. So they replaced Tyler Linderbaum. They reinforced at guard, right? I think they had multiple picks at guard. Or at the very least, they made a pick and a free agency addition. I don't know how quickly I can pull that up. No, I can pull it up pretty quickly there. But the exit of Tyler Linderbaum has people a little panicked there in terms of, will this offensive line be able to recover with his loss, right? I'm of the opinion, because it was subpar last season, right? Not going to lie. It was subpar. Where is Baltimore? Yeah, their first pick was at 14. They took a guard. Did they pick another guard? No, they must have signed another one in free agency. So yeah, they made the first round investment. The replacement for Tyler Linderbaum was, they've got that, but they did not draft that. So the fear there is that, worrying that, is it going to take some time for the new line to gel a little bit, which I think is a valid concern. It might start off a little bit shaky and then figure itself out and kind of gel in terms of chemistry as we get further along in the season. But the pass protection last year was kind of crappy from the Ravens offensive line. So at the end of the day, it sucks that they lost Linderbaum, but I do think they made enough investments around the loss of that position in order to kind of make things push in a positive direction there. So I think it'll be fine in terms of them progressing forward. So I feel good about Lamar. I feel good about Derrick Henry. I feel good about Zay Flowers. I'm a little sketched out beyond that. I've seen a lot of people really wanting to target Mark Andrews, because obviously the loss of all the tight end options around him kind of puts him in a center spotlight there. I just get kind of sketchy because he was very sketchy in terms of his, not his usage last season, right? But for 2 seasons in a row, he has just looked like he might be tilting a little bit towards, the downturn of his career, unfortunately. But volume will be on his side. I've seen people wonder if Rashad Bateman, I think that maybe one of the rookies are going to step up. We haven't heard a ton, and hopefully we can look at training camp and kind of figure it out. But they drafted Jacoby Lane and Elijah Surratt. So both of those are very fine prospects here. So overall, I feel good about the Ravens offense in general. No players that I'm trying to avoid on that team. All positives in general. Donald says, who's your Super Bowl champ pick after the Packers, of course? I try not to be an aggressive homer. I'm just hoping that we can get a nice bounce back season from Jordan Love, because we saw some sketchy, underwhelming behavior last season. So I want to see a bounce back from him. But honestly, I think it's Denver, which I don't like to say because I'm not a Sean Payton fan. He is very irritating, but I low-key think it's Denver, right? I mean, just top to bottom in terms of their team being so solid on both sides of the ball. They made the right investments into their offense as well. Sucks from a fantasy perspective that now we have to deal with Cortland Sutton alongside Jalen Waddle. But, for their offense, I think it was the right choice to help maybe put them over the edge a little bit there. They've got so much depth at receiver as well. They run 5 deep over there very easily. Running back, again, committee. You know what? Actually, now that I'm talking about Denver, let's wrap this up with RJ Harvey here. Perfect segue there. Thank you, Donald. Running back situation is not fun for us from a fantasy perspective, but at the end of the day, they added the depth that they think that they needed. So more than likely, I low-key think that as long as we don't have any injury issues in terms of there being a little, extended recovery time from Bo Nix, but even then, so they would be able to kind of push through that. He should be healthy by the time they would get to the playoffs anyway, if there were any kind of issue there. So yeah, I do think Denver is the most likely candidate there. As crazy as that sounds, yeah. But transitioning from Denver as a potential Super Bowl champion there to looking at that backfield, I got a comment here on one of my videos that said, Coleman and Dobbins are plotters, and the new OC, Davis Webb, plans to run an up-tempo offense. I still have confidence that Harvey can put up numbers comparable to his ADP. So right off the bat here, his ADP is perfectly fine, right? In terms of he would have to get injured, in my opinion, to not pay off at his ADP. But the problem here it happens for wide receivers and running backs. When you get into that RB3, and actually it's probably a little bit more towards wide receivers, but it happens to both. When you get into that RB3 and wide receiver 3 territory, paying off at your ADP is not the baseline of we want, because if you look at the players that finish in those RB3 and wide receiver 3 territory range, it's either guys that got injured and unfortunately had injury games mixed in there, so that's why they ended up in that range, or it's guys that had very mediocre production that was very irritating for the entire season. So if he paid off at his ADP, which is an RB3 as of right now, that's cool, but I don't want RB3 production on the field. When I'm looking at running backs in that range, I want to shoot for guys who could potentially work their way or injure their way into get a running back injured and get them into the territory of having league winning upside because they become a 3-down back. And there's the problem that I have with RJ Harvey, right? Because again, he'll certainly 100% pay off at that ADP. But will we consistently get weeks that are actually winning our league from a fantasy perspective? That's my concern there with him. Because when we look at Coleman and Dodder, you can say they're plotters, right? Because they are the early down backs and they are the goal line backs, and Harvey is the electric pass catching back. But he didn't look so electric on the ground in terms of efficiency. Dobbins outproduced him, outperformed him in terms of yards per carry. And that is something that wasn't just noticeable to us. It was noticeable to Sean Payton. And that is why we got all of that offseason fodder around them investing in a running back in free agency, ultimately not moving forward with that. I mean, they were in the mix for a wide variety of running backs because it was a very deep class, right, in terms of free agency. And while Jonah Coleman isn't the most threatening running back in the world, I do think that he could be the adequate replacement for, and maybe even more than adequate replacement for J.K. Dobbins, because while Dobbins is not a pass catcher, I wouldn't categorize him as a plotter, right? But again, it creates that weird dynamic where we've got Dobbins as the early down and goal line back, and then Harvey as the pass catching back, who also does have red zone upside because they like to bring him in as a receiving option in the red zone. So he can get those receiving touchdowns in the red zone. So it's not as if he's in a situation where he can't get touchdowns, right? But again, it creates those like weird spikes where he is touchdown dependent. And then Dobbins is just rather mediocre production in terms of saying, okay, like if he gets a touchdown, you'll probably get maybe 13 fantasy points, but you hover in that like 7 to 13 fantasy point range, which is cool, but it's not massive, right? My fear here is that, again, I don't know that this backfield would ever 100% turn to RJ Harvey as the 3-down back again, because he was not very efficient on the ground. And Perhaps he has worked on it, but at the end of the day, I just don't trust it, right? So we could say they're plotters, and that they want to run a high tempo offense, but how much more? I don't know how much more up tempo they can actually get, by the way, because Denver checks down to the running backs at a pretty significant rate. Bo Nix loves a check down, right? So it's not as if there's a much higher ceiling in terms of receiving production that is there for RJ Harvey. I think it is what it is. Let me see how quickly I can pull up the target rate, target distribution for running backs. Denver. Yeah, there it is. Denver was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th in targets to running backs in the league. So in terms of up tempo and more volume to Harvey through the air, I don't think it can increase much, to be honest. So that's my only issue there, is that it was already pretty up tempo in terms of heavy checkdowns and receptions for Harvey. So I just got concerns. There, unfortunately. Jumping back to the comments here, we'll do one more and then I got to close things out because, again, this is getting long and this is my problem. My videos have been too long recently. Bear with me. I get excited talking to you guys and sometimes I get a wee bit carried away here, but I appreciate you all sticking around with me. Casey Coleman dropped a good one here with the Raiders wide receiver room being maybe the worst in the league. I understand Bowers is the guy that catches all the balls, but it can't just be him. Don't you think Naylor, Tucker, Besh could be a good late round pick? I think it's Naylor, honestly. Because now granted, I'm not going to hold last year. I think Besh is an issue, right? I read a few nuggets here that doesn't sound like he's picking up and he was picking up in OTAs as much as they would like him to. I would have hoped to hear more positive information about him progressing forward. So I worry that there's still some development that's happening for him. Tucker, I think, is on the right track. And I don't want to hold last year against him because the Raiders offensive line was terrible. Geno Smith was out there fighting for his life. I try to not be super biased and say that what Tucker did last year is indicative of what he would do this year here. But I think I would lean towards Naylor. Yes, I agree with you 100%. I mean, we've got heavy targets that are going to go towards Bowers, right? I mean, expecting 140 makes logical sense for him. We're going to get heavy targets there towards I want to say Jeremiah Love, Ashton Genty. I've been combining their names recently because we're all talking about how Jeremiah Love is the new Ashton Genty of this season. But Ashton Genty there should get a very hefty amount of targets there. We know that Kirk Cousins has no problem checking down, right? So definitely not a detriment if he does start the majority of the season there. But someone else does have to catch the ball, right? They're going to lean on the ground game. And they're going to lean on Brock Bowers. I think Naylor is the target. I think it's worth it for sure to have one of those guys on the end of your bench. Naylor or Tucker is my preference there, with my lean being Naylor, because at the very least we did. Now, we've seen upside from Tucker in the past, right? For sure. But Naylor being the guy that the new regime brought in is what's interesting there, right? And you could make the argument that perhaps in a more diluted wide receiver room that he had in Minnesota, we can see him ascend to a slightly higher level there. So I think that's a good call out right there. Naylor is the one that I think makes sense there for sure. Bob Hope says, what do you think about getting Brown in May in the 3rd round? I like it. I don't mind it at all. I have not done it thus far in the offseason, but I'm not opposed to it for sure. Especially because, again, I hate to pick on the wide receivers, right? But I talked about the fact that I've got a very specific cliff that ends at Amon-Ra St. Brown. And then it picks up in terms of comfort level, oddly enough, at A.J. Brown for sure. Because again, like, yes, switching locations is always a risk, right? But I do think we're going to actually see a slight shift in the New England offense, right? Because the New England offense operated off of aggressive efficiency last season. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that their schedule was much, easier, right? We're going to see a dramatic shift this season in a much tougher schedule. Much tougher defenses probably means reduced efficiency. Reduced efficiency probably means an increase in volume. There's a lot more room for us to get more volume out of Drake May. So my happy place here would be that we see more competitive games. We see an aggressive push in terms of raising up the attempts for Drake May, and direct benefit there is AJ Brown. And I think his ADP is at a very reasonable location. So I do like that as a nice little stack there. If you can grab them, for sure. I like it. I haven't gotten it. I do have Psych though. While I have not grabbed, maybe the reason why I haven't been like actively targeting it is because I do have a dynasty team that has Drake May and AJ Brown, and I really would like that to pay off this season, right? So I've got the combination. It's going to work out somewhere, right? And Savvy Mavi says, which passing of the torch legacy to next gen scenario do you think is more exciting and realistic? Ooh, Kelsey handing the reins to Colston Loveland or Christian McCaffrey making the way for Ashton Genty. Oh, I think Kelsey to Loveland. Yeah. And no offense to Genty, I think this could barely be. I don't mind. The ADP is definitely, it's aggressive, right? But I think we've got enough in terms of safety and changes overall to feel comfortable with where Genty is being drafted, right? But I think the Kelsey to Colston Loveland is very interesting. Like we debate like Luther Burden or Rome Odunze. Oh my God, Rome's foot. But we didn't really see the upside from Luther Burden last season. So what's it going to be? Like honestly, at low key could very easily just be Colston Loveland, right? I mean, the level of upside that we saw from him, the hyper targeting that we saw in the playoffs, and again, to be fair to Rome Odunze, he had been dealing with that injury, and I do not think that he was healthy in the playoffs. I didn't see it. I don't think that he was playing at an optimal level there. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about Rome Odunze if he's healthy. Now, he does have that little foot issue that he says, is kind of just there, unfortunately, in terms of, I guess, scarring from now on. But I'm remaining hopeful that it's something that he can just work through. But Kelsey to Colston Loveland is the one that excites me there. I would not be shocked. And this is very interesting, right? Because my clear 1 and 2 are, Brock Bowers and Trey McBride, right? That's, a tier of their own, right? But when it comes to the next two rankings, between Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren, I go back and forth on that one significantly. And it just kind of, I kind of have been playing it by ear in terms of feel and with league settings and upside and whatnot. I drafted Loveland over Tyler Warren in my Scott Fishbowl team. I just think the upside for him is incredibly high, and the possibility of him ascending to the overall wide receiver 1, it exists, or overall tight end 1, it exists here. It's going to be tough to pass over Bowers just because, again, we just talked about, the hyper targeting that he's going to see this season again, as long as he's healthy with a better quarterback situation, right? But Loveland is the one that is, that's it for me for sure. It's a good question. Let's see here. Do a couple more and then we'll close things out. From Henry Odom. And thank you, Savvy Mavi, for saying liking the video. I appreciate that. Yes, I never asked for likes and subscribes, but I would appreciate it. I'm really trying to push the subscribers as we head into this NFL season. It's going to be fun, guys, so stick around. I've got a lot of videos, more draft videos, obviously, coming the way, but I've got a nice, cool schedule laid out in season that literally hits on everything. Obviously, you guys know I love waivers, so obviously waiver videos, live videos, starts it, rankings. It's going to be fun, so stick around for sure. Henry Odom says, is a round 1 and round 2 pick if Cooks and Allen, is a round 1 and round 2 pick if Cooks and Allen like a bad strategy, sound like a bad strategy. Oh, I wouldn't do it. It's not a terrible strategy, right? But, and I mean, if you're going to tie yourself to a quarterback running back combination there, considering that the vast majority of the touchdowns come from those two people, not the worst strategy in the world. But because I wouldn't do it, right? I know it's difficult to have a comp just to Josh Allen in general because he's been so incredibly consistent, but I would rather go with a combination of Cooks And if you want a high-end quarterback, go with Cooks and a Lamar Jackson, or flip it around and go, Josh Allen and one of the high-end running backs too. I would diversify it a little bit there. Bob Hope says, would take Gibbs over Robinson, number one. I actually just had this conversation with Jake Seeley. I don't know if the video is out. It's either out now or maybe tomorrow, I would assume. On FantasyPros, talking 13 tough running back decisions. We had all the running backs that were kind of close in ADP, and we're debating them. We both agreed that Gibbs is the number one pick. That Robinson is the number one pick over Gibbs. But we don't fault anyone for taking Gibbs because it's kind of probably a little bit negligible there. Gibbs will see an increase in workload with David Montgomery gone, but not a massive increase because they had kind of shifted in the back half of the season to pushing David Montgomery out a little bit, right? And I don't think that we can't see an increase in pass volume. There's not really a shift that we're going to see there. So a little bit more touches on the ground and then a little bit more goal line opportunities. But we have to remember that Robinson will also have more goal line opportunities as well, because there's way too many Robinsons over in Atlanta, or that have been in Atlanta. Jesus Christ. Zach Robinson is no longer the offensive coordinator in Atlanta. Zach Robinson was the one that was giving those touches to Tyler Algier at the goal line over Bijan. Kevin Stefanski's system is in. He has not done I talk crap about Kevin Stefanski, but he doesn't do weird things with running backs. So I do not see Kevin Stefanski opting to give Brian Robinson goal line touches in the same way over Bijan Robinson. So I actually think they'll both see increased touchdown opportunities on the ground as well. So I do still have Bijan Robinson over Gibbs. The Robinsons are going to mess with my head all season. That's so irritating. They could have done anyone else. You could have chosen anyone else. Did you have to make me have to specify Robinsons all season long? Not fun. But outside of that, I appreciate you all tuning in. Excellent show. Excellent conversations. Thank you all so much for joining in. And again, this is the Dear Miss Fantasy Show. It is available on all podcast platforms, and it is hosted by Player Profiler, logo right there down on the screen. So also check out Player Profiler as well. Tons of amazing tools. I believe you can get a 25% discount on any of the tools there if you want, with code Tera, just literally my name, TERA, to get a 25% discount on any of those. And of course, make sure you're checking out the content there. We talk Dynasty here, but there's a lot more shows on Player Profiler that dive a lot deeper into Dynasty as well, if you're looking for more, and Best Ball too as well. Lots of specialty shows there, so make sure you check those out. And then also check out my YouTube channel, depending on where you're watching this, at It's Tera Time. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will be back next week. And get pumped next week, because as we are inching closer and closer to training camp, maybe we do a little training camp preview next week. Yeah, because then the next week after that, we'll be in training camp. So we maybe talk about the things that we need to be on the lookout for in training camp, because there are a lot of situations that we've got to solve here in fantasy season. So we'll have another fun show. Same time, same place, Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST here. I will talk to you all later. Have a wonderful week and weekend. Bye, guys.
You know, it's important to me that all of our media be free, but it is you, the premium subscriber, with access to data analysis, the rankings, Dynasty Deluxe, DFS Dominator, the world famous draft kit. You get that content and you make all of this possible. The free podcasts, articles, NFL draft content. So I must give a special thanks to all of our premium subscribers. You make all of this possible.